2 hours ago, the White House signed an executive order that university presidents across the United States are currently describing in calls to their boards of trustees as the single most damaging action any administration has taken against American higher education in the modern era. Not a funding cut, not a regulatory change. A direct federal seizure of student visa status affecting every Canadian national currently enrolled in an American university, approximately 500,000 students, reclassified overnight as non-priority visa holders subject to immediate review and potential revocation. The directive invokes national security authority to designate Canadian student visa holders as requiring enhanced screening on the grounds that Canadian universities have allegedly permitted Chinese academic partnerships that compromise American research security. The logic: Canadian students trained at institutions with Chinese research ties represent a potential vector for technology transfer. The remedy: freeze every Canadian student visa in the American system and subject each one to individual review with no defined timeline. Individual review. For 500,000 students. The agency processing these reviews currently handles approximately 3,000 individual visa reviews per month. The math produces a queue measured not in weeks, but in years. A Canadian student currently in their second year of a doctoral program at MIT woke up this morning to find their legal status in the United States classified as pending review. They cannot leave the country without risking re-entry. They cannot work on research that involves any restricted technology. They cannot, in many cases, continue the laboratory work their programs require. They are suspended in legal amber by a directive that will take longer to process than most of them have left in their degrees. The directive has 3 operational components, each designed to apply pressure at a different point in the educational system. First, all Canadian student visas are reclassified from standard F1 status to enhanced review pending status. The reclassification does not immediately revoke any visa. What it does is suspend the automatic renewal process, freeze any pending visa extensions, and flag every affected student in the federal travel system. A Canadian student whose visa was set to renew next month now has no renewal pathway until individual review is complete. Second, any American university that employs Canadian graduate students as teaching or research assistants, which is virtually every research university in the country, is required to file individual compliance certifications for each Canadian national within 30 days. Attesting that their research activities do not touch any technology category subject to export control. The compliance burden falls on the universities. At a major research institution with 2,000 Canadian graduate students, the legal and administrative cost of 2,000 individual compliance certifications is not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It is a financial crisis. Third, any American university that has an active partnership, exchange agreement, or joint research program with a Canadian institution that itself has any Chinese academic partnership, however indirect, is placed under federal research security review. The definition of indirect Chinese academic partnership in the directive is broad enough that virtually every major Canadian university qualifies, which means virtually every major American university with Canadian institutional partnerships, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Yale, Johns Hopkins, Michigan, UCLA, is now under federal review simultaneously. Washington's internal name for this strategy: campus pressure. The calculation: 500,000 Canadian students generate approximately $36 billion in annual tuition, housing, and spending for American universities and the communities around them. Threaten that revenue stream, and university presidents, who control some of the most influential lobbying networks in Washington, would pressure Ottawa to resolve whatever triggered the directive. The strategy assumed that Canadian students were a financial lever Washington could pull to move a Canadian government. It did not model what Ottawa would do with the lever. 56 minutes after the directive was made public, Carney did not appear at a podium. He convened a joint emergency session of Canada's university presidents, all 97 of them, via secure video link, and the Canadian Minister of Education and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The session lasted 11 minutes. What came out of it was announced simultaneously by all 97 institutions in a coordinated statement that had clearly been drafted well before the session was convened. Canada is immediately suspending the academic credential recognition agreements under which Canadian institutions validate American university degrees for professional licensing, graduate admission, and employer qualification in Canada. Not permanently. Under review. But under review with no defined timeline and with the explicit condition that review will not conclude while the Student Visa Directive remains in effect. The implications landed on American university administrators before the statement finished loading on their screens. A Canadian medical school will not accept a graduate of an American pre-med program whose credentials are under review. A Canadian law society will not admit to the bar an American-trained lawyer whose degree institution is not recognized. A Canadian engineering association will not certify an American-trained engineer. A Canadian employer requiring professional credentials will not hire a graduate of an unrecognized institution. For American graduates who plan to work, study further, or practice professionally in Canada, a category that includes hundreds of thousands of people annually, the credential suspension creates an immediate and concrete barrier that did not exist yesterday. Then came the 4 countermeasures Carney announced personally, each one revealing a layer of preparation that campus pressure had not anticipated. The first, Canada is immediately launching an accelerated visa and scholarship program for Canadian students currently enrolled in American universities, offering full federal funding to transfer to Canadian institutions with full credit recognition and no academic penalty. The program, called the Canada Academic Continuity Initiative, had been designed, funded, and administratively prepared over 9 months. The application portal went live at the exact moment Carney finished speaking. Every Canadian student in an American university received an email within the hour. The subject line, "Your education is secure, here is how." The second countermeasure was the one that made American university presidents reach for their phones immediately. Canada is redirecting the international student recruitment infrastructure that Canadian universities have built over decades. Offices in 47 countries, relationships with 12,000 secondary schools globally, to explicitly position Canadian universities as the stable, politically reliable alternative to American institutions operating under federal visa uncertainty. The message being delivered to prospective international students in India, China, South Korea, Nigeria, and Brazil is precise. American universities cannot guarantee your visa status. Canadian universities can. The international student market, worth $37 billion annually to American universities, is being targeted at its source. But this is where the response became something that no university administrator in America had modeled as possible. The third countermeasure, Canada is filing a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization arguing that the Student Visa Directive constitutes a discriminatory trade barrier against Canadian educational services exports under the General Agreement on Trade in Services. Educational services are a traded commodity under GATS. Canada exports educational services to the United States in the form of Canadian students who pay tuition at American institutions, services that generate economic value and are governed by trade law. The filing argues that targeting Canadian nationals specifically constitutes discriminatory treatment of a service exporter, triggering formal WTO dispute proceedings. It is the first time in the WTO's history that student visa policy has been challenged as a services trade barrier. The legal team that prepared the filing had been working on it for 7 months. The fourth countermeasure was the one that converted a bilateral education dispute into a global reputational crisis for American higher education. Canada is formally notifying 34 countries, every nation with a significant student population in American universities, that the United States government has demonstrated its willingness to reclassify foreign student visa status as a political instrument. The notification is not framed as anti-American. It is framed as information. Governments and families considering American university enrollment for their students should be aware that visa status in the United States is now subject to unilateral executive reclassification without notice, without timeline, and without individual appeal. Canada is not telling other countries to avoid American universities. It is ensuring that every government making enrollment decisions has the information Washington would prefer they not have. The American higher education system's reaction was the fastest and most unified institutional response this confrontation has yet produced. Because universities are not slow-moving bureaucracies when their financial survival is at stake. The Association of American Universities, representing the 71 leading research universities in the United States, issued a statement within 90 minutes describing the directive as an unprecedented federal intrusion into university operations that threatens the research enterprise, the financial stability of American institutions, and the international standing of American higher education. Harvard's president issued a personal statement. MIT's president issued a personal statement. The presidents of Yale, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Michigan issued a joint statement. These are not institutions that speak in unison. They were speaking in unison. The financial exposure they were responding to is calculable and immediate. Canadian students at American universities generate approximately $36 billion annually in direct economic impact. The compliance certification requirement for teaching and research assistants creates legal costs that MIT's General Counsel estimated publicly at over $40 million for that institution alone. The Federal Research Security Review, affecting institutions with Canadian partnerships, touches the grant funding streams, NIH, NSF, DARPA, that fund the research that makes American universities globally competitive. The directive does not just threaten Canadian student tuition, it threatens the research funding ecosystem that American academic science depends on. Congressional reaction crossed every expected line. Republican senators from states with major research universities, Texas, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, contacted the White House demanding explanation before the afternoon was over. The chair of the Senate Education Committee announced hearings. 3 Republican representatives whose districts include major university towns issued statements calling for immediate suspension of the directive pending review. The international response confirmed what Canada's 4th countermeasure was designed to produce. India's Ministry of Education issued a statement noting that Indian students, the largest foreign student population in American universities at over 300,000, would be monitoring the American visa situation closely when making enrollment decisions. South Korea's Ministry of Education expressed concern. The United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and Germany, the 4 nations that compete most directly with American universities for international students, all issued statements affirming their commitment to visa stability for international students. The competitive framing was unmistakable and intentional. Trump has 3 paths, and each one runs into a wall that was built before the directive was signed. Maintain the directive and watch the Canada Academic Continuity Initiative pull Canadian students out of American universities over the coming months, while Canada's international recruitment campaign converts American visa uncertainty into a permanent competitive advantage for Canadian institutions. Every Canadian student who transfers is a tuition payment that does not return when the directive is lifted. Every international student who chooses Toronto over Boston because of visa stability is a student American universities cannot recover. Rescind the directive, but the WTO filing is already submitted. The credential recognition suspension remains in effect until the visa directive is lifted and a formal bilateral education stability agreement is signed. Canada has stated the conditions clearly. Rescission of the directive is the beginning of the process, not the end of it. Escalate and accelerate the international reputational damage that Canada's 4th countermeasure has already initiated. Every escalation is another data point for the 34 governments Canada has formally notified. Every data point makes the Canadian competitive narrative more credible to the families and governments making enrollment decisions for the next academic year. 2 hours ago, the White House thought it had found a lever that would move Ottawa through its universities. 2 hours later, American university presidents are in emergency calls with their boards. The WTO has received a filing that will be studied in trade law courses for decades, and 34 governments are reading a Canadian notification that American student visas are a political instrument. Campus pressure was designed to make Canadian students the pressure point. Carney converted them into the constituency that turned American universities against their own government in a single afternoon. Washington wanted compliance. It got a coalition of 97 university presidents, a WTO filing, a global recruitment campaign, and a credential suspension that will outlast every news cycle this directive generates.